Imagine it is July 1944. In the grand ballroom of a secluded hotel in New Hampshire, the world's leading economists are drafting the blueprint for a new global era. They emerge with the Bretton Woods system, a framework that crowns the United States dollar as the undisputed king of finance and the anchor for every other currency on Earth. For 80 years, this green piece of paper has been more than just money. It has been the oxygen of global trade, the ultimate safe haven, and the primary tool of American geopolitical leverage. But as we move toward the late 2020s, the air is starting to thin. In the halls of a high-stakes summit in Kazan, the leaders of an expanded BRICS bloc are no longer talking about simply reforming the current system. They are preparing to replace it. The question they are asking is one that would have been economically unthinkable just a decade ago. What happens when the world's largest commodity producers decide they no longer want to breathe the dollar's oxygen? For decades, the United States has enjoyed what is known as exorbitant privilege. This unique advantage allows the U.S. to run massive deficits, borrow cheaply, and project power globally simply because the rest of the world is forced to hold dollars to buy essential goods like oil, wheat, and copper. It is a financial superpower that has remained largely unchallenged since the end of the Second World War. Yet, in an era of increasing sanctions and shifting alliances, that privilege is being viewed by much of the world less as a global service and more as a strategic liability. Enter the R5, or the unit. This isn't just another digital payment app or a loose collection of trade agreements. It is a proposed unified physical commodity-anchored currency designed to bypass the volatility of fiat money and the reach of Western oversight. Backed by a tangible reserve basket, 40% physical gold, combined with the massive output of global oil production and a near monopoly on rare earth elements, the unit represents a fundamental shift back toward hard assets. If successful, it would mark the first credible, structural threat to the post-Bretton Woods order in history. Today, we explore a world where this divergence becomes reality. We are looking at a future where the hegemony of the greenback ends not with a whimper, but with a commodity-backed rebellion that redraws the maps of power, trade, and sovereign debt across the entire planet. 2. The divergence point, the 2026 Commodity Accord. This divergence isn't born in a vacuum. It is the child of a perfect economic storm that breaks in early 2026. After years of persistent inflation in the West and the unprecedented freezing of sovereign reserves, the trust that once underpinned the global financial architecture has effectively evaporated. The catalyst is the 2026 Commodity Accord, a historic treaty signed in Kazan that marks the formal end of the era of blind faith. No longer content with a system where their assets can be switched off with a keystroke in Washington, the BRICS Plus nations decide to anchor their future to something the world cannot simply print into existence: physical reality. At the heart of this accord is the unit, a revolutionary currency framework designed to solve the age-old problem of trust among rivals. To prevent any one nation, be it China or India, from dominating the others, they turn to a basket of tangible assets. They start with gold, assigning it a heavy 40% weighting. This isn't just a number on a ledger. It is backed by physical audits and escrowed in neutral zones, leveraging the more than 6,000 tons of gold these nations have been quietly hoarding for years. But they don't stop at the yellow metal. To reflect the modern industrial world, they bake in the very resources the West is desperate to secure: nearly half of global oil production and a staggering 75% of the world's rare earth processing power. By tying the unit to energy and the building blocks of the high-tech future, these nations create a hybrid asset-backed system that bypasses the traditional fiat trap. For the first time since the collapse of the gold standard in 1971, the world is offered a currency that doesn't rely on the promises of a single government, but on the raw productive power of the global South. It is a system built on blockchain for transparency and speed, but ultimately settled in atoms for security. As the ink dries on the Kazan Agreement, the message to the international community is clear. If you want the world's resources, you must pay on the world's terms. The era of the dollar as the global default setting is over, replaced by a ledger where value is determined not by a central bank's policy, but by the weight of gold and the flow of oil. Once the unit moves from a diplomatic document to a live trading floor, the shock to the global energy market is instantaneous. The first tremor hits when the world's major oil producers, led by the newly solidified partnership between Riyadh and Moscow, formally announced that they will no longer accept the US dollar as the exclusive medium for their crude exports. This is not merely a policy shift. It is a direct assault on the petrodollar recycling system that has fueled Western financial dominance for half a century. Suddenly, central banks in Tokyo, Berlin, and London find themselves scrambling. They are holding trillions in dollars, but those dollars can no longer buy the energy their economies need to survive. To keep the lights on, they must now enter the R5 market, effectively forced to purchase a currency backed by the very competitors they have sought to isolate. As the energy markets reel, a second, more surgical strike originates from the east. Beijing, controlling 3/4 of the planet's rare earth processing, begins pricing the essential minerals required for everything from electric vehicle batteries to advanced missile guidance systems exclusively in the unit. For Western manufacturers, the cost of innovation suddenly becomes tied to the price of gold and the stability of the BRICS basket. This is more than a price hike. It is a total loss of supply chain sovereignty. The Green Revolution in Europe and North America finds itself hostage to a currency regime it does not control, forcing a radical re-evaluation of national security and industrial policy. This dual-track squeeze triggers a massive rerouting of global commerce that begins to favor the international north-south transport corridor over traditional Atlantic-centric routes. Trade begins to flow through internal Eurasian and global south networks, bypassing the traditional maritime choke points where Western naval power has long ensured the safety of dollar-denominated goods. In this environment, the concept of seigniorage, the profit made by an issuer of money, shifts dramatically. For the first time, the economic rents of global trade are being collected by the producers of tangible wealth rather than the managers of fiat debt. The BRICS nations are no longer just the world's factory or its fuel pump, they have become the world's vault. And the shockwave of this realization is only the beginning of a total financial realignment. As the commodity markets settle into this new reality, the second major tremor hits the very foundation of the global financial system, the mountain of sovereign debt. For decades, emerging economies across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia have been trapped in a cycle of borrowing in US dollars to fund their development, only to find themselves strangled by interest rate hikes in Washington or the sudden strengthening of the greenback. But as the unit establishes itself as a stable, asset-backed alternative, these nations are presented with a historic escape hatch. Faced with the choice of continuing to service crippling USD-denominated debt or pivoting to a system where they can pay with the very commodities they produce, many choose to default on the old order and refinance through the new one. This mass migration triggers a debt revaluation that the West is wholly unprepared for. In Washington and New York, this pivot creates a terrifying feedback loop known as the Triffin dilemma in reverse. For 80 years, the United States was able to run massive trade deficits because the world needed to hold dollars. Now, as that demand evaporates, those trillions of dollars begin to flood back home, chasing a shrinking supply of domestic goods and services. To prevent total currency collapse and lure investors back, the U.S. Treasury is forced to hike interest rates to levels not seen in generations. While this might defend the dollar's value on paper, it simultaneously suffocates the American economy under the weight of its own debt pile. The cost of servicing that debt begins to consume the federal budget, gutting infrastructure, social programs, and defense spending, and signaling a structural decline that can no longer be ignored. Meanwhile, the R5 nations experience a different kind of economic gravity. Because the unit is anchored to physical gold and essential resources, it acts as a massive dampener against the hypervolatility of the transitioning world. While the dollar and the euro swing wildly on speculation and fear, the unit retains a stubborn, heavy stability. This creates a stark divergence. The established Western economies find themselves fighting a desperate war against stagflation and high borrowing costs, while the BRICS-aligned world begins to benefit from a new kind of hard money security. The global financial hierarchy is being inverted, and the leverage is shifted from those who print paper to those who hold the atoms that keep the modern world running. The emergence of the unit does not go unanswered. In Washington, the initial dismissal of a BRICS currency as a mirage rapidly evaporates, replaced by a doctrine of aggressive financial containment. The first weapon deployed is the hammer of the American consumer market. Leveraging a strategy of 100% reciprocal tariffs, the U.S. issues a blunt ultimatum. Any nation that backs a rival currency to replace the dollar faces immediate and total exclusion from the wonderful U.S. economy. This marks the beginning of a brutal era of sanctions warfare, where the Treasury Department issues executive orders specifically targeting the unit's physical settlement mechanisms. By designating the very vaults where the R5's gold and oil reserves are escrowed as blocked entities, the West attempts to criminalize the plumbing of the new system, forcing every global bank into a zero-sum choice between the legacy of SWIFT and the promise of the Accord. Yet, this retaliation reveals deep fractures within the Western alliance itself, exposing a classic game theory trap. While the United States can afford a trade war, its European and Asian allies are far more exposed to the commodity squeeze. In Brussels, leaders are caught in a agonizing vice. They are politically bound to the NATO security umbrella, but economically tethered to the very energy and rare earth flows that are now priced in units. If Germany or France break ranks to secure the minerals needed for their industrial survival, the G7's united front collapses. To counter this, the West launches Project Vault, a massive, state-led effort to build strategic critical mineral reserves and a bias cartel designed to cap the price of BRICS energy. It is a desperate attempt to create a command economy of the West to rival the resource-backed bloc of the East. The most sophisticated move, however, is the attempt to fracture the BRICS coalition from within, specifically targeting the India pivot. Recognizing that the bloc is far from a monolith, U.S. diplomats offer New Delhi unprecedented technology transfers and friendshoring incentives, betting that India's historical rivalry with China and its need for economic stability will outweigh the allure of a unified R5. The G7 calculates that if they can convince India to stay within a reformed dollar sphere, the unit remains a regional project rather than a global successor. As 2026 unfolds, the world becomes a geopolitical chessboard where money is the ultimate piece. Every nation is now forced to play a high-stakes game of prisoner's dilemma, where the cost of loyalty to the old order is high, but the price of joining the rebellion could be a total break from the global trade system that built the modern world. However, the grand architecture of the unit faces a structural paradox that no amount of gold can easily solve: the internal friction of the BRICS bloc itself. While the commodity accord looks formidable on paper, it relies on a level of trust that historical rivals like India and China have rarely demonstrated. In this scenario, the reality check begins when the disparate economic needs of the members start to pull the currency apart. This is the challenge of the optimum currency area. For a single currency to work, the participating economies need to be synchronized, but the BRICS nations are steady in divergence. A policy that benefits China's high-tech manufacturing giant might be a disaster for South Africa's resource-dependent economy or Brazil's agricultural cycles. Without a central political union or shared fiscal treasury, the unit risks becoming a straitjacket similar to what the Eurozone experienced during its darkest debt crises, but without the cultural or institutional glue to hold it together. Beyond the geopolitics lies the cold math of liquidity. Even with over 6,000 tons of gold, there is a fundamental question of whether there is enough physical bullion on the planet to facilitate trillions of dollars in global trade without causing the price of gold to skyrocket to levels that would crash the very industries the unit is meant to protect. If the gold backing becomes too thin, the unit risks becoming a paper tiger, a currency that claims to be backed by atoms but is actually just another fiat promise with a gold-painted facade. Furthermore, the bloc faces the looming threat of the Dutch disease. For nations like Russia or Saudi Arabia, a currency heavily weighted by the value of their own exports can lead to an artificially strong exchange rate. This makes their non-resource exports, such as Russian technology or Saudi services, uncompetitively expensive on the global market, effectively hollowing out their domestic industries in favor of a resource case. Finally, there is the coordination failure. The unit requires every member to surrender a degree of monetary sovereignty, the power to print money to solve domestic problems. In a moment of crisis, would New Delhi or Beijing really prioritize the stability of the R5 over their own internal political survival? If one major member begins to cheat by devaluing their national currency or failing to meet their gold escrow requirements, the entire system could face a catastrophic bank run. The very transparency of the blockchain ledger that makes the unit modern also makes it fragile. The moment a discrepancy appears in the physical reserves, the world's markets would react with a speed that could vaporize the currency's credibility overnight. The reality check reminds us that while the dollar's reign is old and weary, replacing it requires more than just commodities. It requires a level of unity that the world's rising powers have yet to prove they can sustain. Whether the unit becomes the new global standard or collapses under the weight of its own internal contradictions, the experiment itself marks a definitive end to the era of financial complacency. The 2026 Commodity Accord is far more than a technical adjustment to trade. It is a declaration of independence from the post-1945 order, signaling that the unipolar moment has finally been replaced by a multiplex world. By attempting to anchor the future to gold, oil, and rare earth elements, the BRICS nations have forced a global conversation on what actually constitutes value. For 80 years, we lived in a world where the primary requirement for reserve currency was trust in a single nation's institutions. Now, we are entering a world where that trust is being weighed against the cold, hard reality of physical assets. At the heart of this struggle is an educational shift in how we understand money itself. For generations, we have lived under the reign of fiat money, currency that has value because a government says it does and because we believe in their ability to manage an economy. It is a system of pure credit and debt, flexible but fragile. The rise of the unit represents a return to commodity money, where currency's worth is tied directly to physical atoms that have intrinsic utility in the real world. This isn't just a change in currency. It is a change in philosophy. It suggests that in a time of extreme geopolitical and digital uncertainty, the only true safety is found in things you can touch, burn, or build with. As we look toward the horizon of 2030, we are left with a fundamental question for a new age. In an increasingly digital world where our lives are defined by bits and bytes, is a return to physical atoms the ultimate hedge against a collapsing order? Or are we witnessing a desperate attempt to use 19th century tools to solve the complex, high-speed problems of the 21st century? The answer will likely define the next century of human history. This has been a journey through speculative alternate history for educational and entertainment purposes only. It does not predict future events or endorse specific political outcomes, but rather serves as a framework to understand the tectonic shifts currently moving beneath the surface of our global economy. Whether the unit succeeds or fails, the transition from trust in governments to trust in tangible assets has already begun to redraw the map of our world.